Here we are. Okay, we are on Beis Amud Beis. We are at the top of the page, Meisvei. If you're on the article, the third paragraph, and what we've been discussing is this question: what does or mean? Does it mean night? Does it mean day? Of course, or also means light, but the real question is, in our Mishnah, the Mishnah began by saying or la'arba asar, which one opinion says that means the night of the 14th, meaning the night before. The night before Pesach, and the other understood or l'arba asar means the day of the 14th, right? So the Gemara is going back and forth trying to bring proofs one way or another. So let's see. Meisvei, we bring a proof from another pasuk. There's a pasuk in Iyov. Yachshechu, you see the third paragraph, Meisvei. We bring a question from the following pasuk. Yachshechu kochvei nishpei yikav leor v'ayin v'yira b'af ape shachar. May the stars of his night be dimmed. Let it. We understand it to mean over here, let the night crave or is undefined, okay? But there is none. May it not see the blush of dawn. Okay, so the simple understanding of the pasuk is that may the stars of his night be dimmed, and let the night crave or. The fact that it says let the night crave or, but there is none, alma or yamamahu. It sounds like the pasuk is saying that the night will crave day. Right? It sounds like the night, right? Let the night, the stars of his night be dimmed, and let the night crave or, meaning let the night crave day, which would seem to demonstrate, so this would seem to be a proof that night actually means day. So the Gemara says, no, maybe night in this pasuk does not mean day. Rather, hasam melat hu de kalayit le'iyov lemazale. Rather, Iyov is cursing himself. He's not talking about the night. The subject in that pasuk is actually himself, and this is what he's saying. Amar, he said, Yeirava, may it be God's will, delitzbe hachgavr lenahora v'lo lishkeche. May it be the will of God that this person, he's referring to himself, should wait for light and not find it. In other words, if the subject in the pasuk is a reference to the night, then you understand the night is desiring for it to be over, it's desiring for the day. If the subject is himself, then you could say what he's waiting for, what he's hoping for is to find the light and not the day. Once again, it's that same back and forth where these psukim, we initially ask, hey, it should mean night or it should be day, and the answer is, the Gemara rejects this by saying, yes, but remember the word or could also mean light. And many of these questions will be answered by this question. Some of them, by this answer, some of them, as we'll see, will not be able to answer that way. Okay, the Gemara asks from another question. Meisvei, another question on those who understand, Rabbi Yehuda who understands or means night. V'omar ach choshech yishufeni v'layla or ba'adeni. I said only darkness will shadow me, but the night becomes or around me. Okay, so this is David HaMelech speaking. He says that I thought that I'm going to be completely overwhelmed by the darkness. Okay, but then the night becomes or. So in that context, what does it sound like? The night becomes day. It sounds like David HaMelech is saying, like, on the one hand, I thought I was going to be enveloped by the darkness of the night, okay? But then the night becomes, or sounds like he's saying, the night turns into day. Hashem save me. That's the simple read of the pasuk. So Alma Ar Yamamahu. Once again, it sounds like or is day. So the Gemara says no. Hasam Hachi Kamar David. This is what David meant to say. Ani Amarti Ach Choshech Yishufeni Le'olam Haba. Shudoma Leyom. Okay, a little bit of a convoluted read, but he says, I thought that only darkness will shadow me even in the world to come. And the world to come is typically throughout biblical literature, the world to come is symbolized by the word daytime, by the word day. So he says, I thought that in the world to come it's going to be dark for me. And how does he refer to the world to come? By referring to it as day, right? But now, even in this world, which is typically seen as the metaphor we use for this world is night, or ba'adeni, it's become light around me. Okay, so once again, David HaMelech is contrasting not actual day and night, but rather he's contrasting the world to come, which is referred to as daytime, which is referred to as a day, and he says, but now even in this world, which is typically considered like night, there is going to be light around me, and that's what the word or means in this pasuk, not daytime, but rather light. Okay, so David HaMelech again begins by thinking that it's all over, everything's going to be bad, he's going to be suffering so much, and then he says, no, instead I have light. Okay, so again, but the word or does not mean, could not mean daytime, instead it could mean light. Meisvei, another question, and here we're going to start again. Now here we're actually going to prove our point. Rabbi Yehuda says, Borkin or laba asr. This is a quote from a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, and this is a very interesting opinion, thank God we don't pass in this way, that Rabbi Yehuda says we actually do bedikas chametz 3 times. You ready for that? Don't worry, we don't pass in that way. Rabbi Yehuda says, Bodkin or laba asr, you check for the chametz at quote unquote or of the 14th. Uva arba asar shachris. And number 2 is on the morning of the 14th. Uva shasabir, and again at the time that you burn the chametz. Okay, but he says 3 times. Or undefined, that term that's undefined. Then he says in the morning, and when the chametz is burnt. Now, Medika Amar Yehuda Bodkin or Arba Asar, Uva Arba Asar Shacharis. The fact of Yehuda says you search on the or of the 14th, and then again on the morning. So what does it sound like or means? Night. Alma or Artahu. Clearly, the fact that it says, again, it says 3 times. It says or Arba Asar, then it says the day of the 14th, and then at the time of burning. So clearly, what is the or being the first one in the sequence? Or clearly means the night. If it would mean day, he'd be repeating himself. Right? So Alma or Artahu, clearly or is used for night, Shma Mina, and we actually do prove and we accept that or actually means night. And basically therefore we read the Mishnah, which is the way we read the Mishnah when we first started it, that or l'arba asr, that the night of the 14th, which is what we do, right? We check the chametz. Now going back to our Mishnah, if we've just established that or means night, then the way to read our Mishnah that we read yesterday is that at the night of the 14th, meaning the night before Pesach, is when we do b'dikas chametz. Now usually a Gemara would, and now because we've just proven our point, what's interesting is our Gemara continues to ask questions about this question of what exactly does or mean. The commentators assume that what's happening over here is that the authors of the Gemara, keep in mind, the authors of the Gemara, what they were really editors. And they took from different discussions that took place that were recorded and were oral traditions in different batei medrash, in different study halls, and they kind of merged them together. Sometimes they did so, we'll call it cleanly, and just kind of merge it all into one. And sometimes they'll take one discussion, put it over here, and then they'll put this like a not a contrasting, but like a parallel discussion and put it over here. So really the Gemara has established its point, or does mean night, definitively. Okay. However, the Gemara is going to continue this discussion and almost like continue to ask these questions. Does or actually mean night? Does or mean day? Okay. And one thing we'll have to think about, which we're not going to address today, is why does the Mishnah speak in such a ambiguous and funny way? If you wanted to say that you do b'dikas chametz on the night of the 14th, what would you say? Balayla. Say night. Why in the world do you say or l'arba asar, which is such a confusing term? That's a question we're going to address tomorrow. Yes, Max.
I'm just wondering, where does Rabbi Yehuda get this idea that you would have to search 3 times?
Okay, we'll see them in Chesed Beis. We're going to get there. We'll see there. Yeah, we'll get there. The Gemara is going to unpack this. Okay, so we'll ask another few questions. Meisvei. Again, we're going to challenge Rav Huna's opinion. Be'masei arba asar Asar Basias Malacha. Okay, from when is work prohibited on the 14th of Nisan? So there are different customs in different communities. Nowadays, the standard minhag is that we actually do not do malacha. We don't do full-fledged work unless it's something which is relevant to the preparation of Pesach. But we don't do work from Chatzos and on. Like if we have a job, business, whatever, you're supposed to close it from Chatzos, from midday and on Erev Pesach. Okay? If your work is relevant to preparing for Pesach, it'd be a different story. Okay? But generally speaking, if you have like, whatever, you sell boats. Yeah, no one's going boating, on the Pesach, you got to close your shop down from midday and on. Okay? However, the rabbinic traditions of actually prohibiting malacha, prohibiting work, even earlier. Okay? So that's what the Gemara is going to discuss. And if, we don't have these traditions, there were communities which had traditions of not doing malacha even before midday. Okay? And the Gemara is going to discuss the different opinions about when this prohibition kicks in. So we must say arba asar basias malacha. So the Brisa says, from when is work prohibited on the 14th of Nisan? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Mishas ha'or. He says from the time of or. Again, that's our magic term that we're trying to define. Okay, so he says from the time of or. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mishas ha'netzachama, from the time of sunrise. Okay, so one opinion says from quote unquote or, undefined term, and the other says from sunrise. And now the Brisa continues with the dialogue. Amr relay Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says Rabbi Yehuda, who Rabbi Yehuda again was the one who said that it's from sunrise. Yom. Where do we find a day? Shemiktaso asur basias malacha, umiktaso mutter basias malacha. Okay, so the Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is the one who says that the prohibition kicks in at quote unquote or, and he says to his colleague who he's arguing with, Rabbi Yehuda, said it's from sunrise, he says, where do we ever find a prohibition against work that is not the entire day? Right? That's the argument that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says to Rabbi Yehuda. There's no precedent for malacha, for prohibited activity, which is only going to be partial, only going to be part of the day. It's always an entire day. Okay, Amar Le, Rabbi Yehuda replies to him, Hu atzma yachiach. He says, no, but the 14th of Nisan is actually a proof that we split up days. Why? Shemiksaso mutter b'achilas chametz, umiksaso asur b'achilas chametz. The 14th itself is a day which the prohibitions are split, right? Because the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, is a day where part of the day we cannot eat chametz, right? And part of the day we do eat chametz. So he says, look, he answered, the question to him was posed, hey, when do we ever have a day which part of the day you can't do work and part of the day you can? There's no precedent for such a thing. He says, what are you talking about? The 14th of Nisan itself is a day where Isurim prohibitions only apply for certain parts of the day and not other parts of the day, right? And therefore there is precedent for splitting up the day. Okay, so now the Gemara, that's the end quotes. That's the end of the Brisa. Now, the fact that Yehuda says that work is forbidden from the time of sunrise, right? So the first opinion, Alma or Deka Amar Rabbi Eliezer and Yaakov or Tahu. That means Rabbi Eliezer and Yaakov, when he says that the malacha is prohibited from or, what is he referring to? If they're arguing, one opinion says sunrise, the other opinion says, no, it cannot be done from or, right? If one opinion is saying sunrise, the other opinion is saying something else, what's the something else? Night, right? Okay, so therefore, the Gemara says, no, lo, there's another possibility. What does Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov mean? My or, Amud Shachar. It could mean he means daybreak. It could mean he means daybreak, right? In other words, there are actually two parts of the morning which have different halachos. And although, one opinion we know he means sunrise. The other opinion he has this undefined term or. So we initially assume or means night, and now we're saying no. Or could actually mean dawn, right? Dawn would be the earlier time where we start to see a little bit of light, but before the sun actually rises. Ask the Gemara, Ihachi, if you want to tell me that or in this context means dawn and not, daybreak / dawn, as opposed to sunrise, Ihachi, Dika Amar Le, Heicha Matzinu Yom, Shemiksaso Mutter Basiyas Malacha, Miksaso Asr Basiyas Malacha, Nema Iu Lenafshe. Ha'ika Laila Hudashari. So if you want to tell me that or in this context means dawn, then the argument that he made in the Brisa is actually no longer stands. Again, what was his argument to his colleague? His argument was, where do we ever find a day where part of the day is forbidden and part of the day is allowed? Now, if he was the one who held that night is when the prohibition kicks in, then what he says makes a lot of sense. He's saying, we never find a day that's split up when it comes to a prohibition against work. You either have a full 24 hours, 25 hours, or you don't. But now you're telling me that he himself holds that it's dawn. So his argument that he makes against his colleague, he should say to himself, he himself is also saying there's a prohibition only from dawn and on, but not from the night before. So the Gemara says no. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Hachikamar. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this is what he says. Bishlama lididi, my opinion, who holds that it's dawn, makes sense. We find many places where the rabbis distinguish between day and night, meaning full-fledged day, which is dawn, and night. Why? Because we have by a public fast. We just had Shavas B'Tammuz. When did Shavas B'Tammuz begin? What time of the day? I don't mean what time of the day, like what hour, but what dawn, right? So we find precedents where our sages distinguish between dawn and then the daytime starting at dawn and the night before. Right? Because the Brisa said, "Amasei ochel l'shosa." When we fast, until when could you eat in the day? Ad she'alma l'shachar, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, until the first light of dawn. Rabbi Shimon Omer ad kros hagever, until the rooster crows. We're not going to get into what exactly they're arguing about, but the point is that everyone agrees that a fast day begins more or less at dawn. Right? So we have precedent that sages make that distinction. Elidcha, according to you, we have no precedence where the rabbis make a distinction once it's already day. In other words, we do have precedence that there's a distinction between full-fledged nighttime and dawn and on, as we see by fast day. And therefore, that supports my approach that when it comes to the prohibition against work, which the rabbis instituted, it makes sense that they did so at dawn. Okay? But according to you, who hold that the prohibition kicks in at sunrise, where do we ever find a distinction being made when it's already daylight, when it's already daytime? Doesn't make any sense. So Amar Le, so Rabbi Yehuda replies to him, he says, no, the 14th of Nisan actually proves my point. Why? Because on the 14th of Nisan, we find during the day itself, right? During the 10th, during the 10th hour, during 10 o'clock and on, we have the prohibition of eating chametz. Doesn't start in the beginning of the day. Imagine that. Imagine you would not be lining up for Dunkin' Donuts at whatever it is. It would start in the beginning of the day. The rabbis broke up the day itself. So you see the 14th of Nisan itself. Okay, fine. Shaper Kamer Le Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara now points out Rabbi Yehuda's response to Rabbi Eliezer is actually a very good response. So Hachi Kamer Le Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara says that Rabbi Eliezer would say back to this question, Amina lachana malacha d'Rabbanan. I'm talking about a rabbinic prohibition against work. Va'at amras li chametz d'oraisa, and you are responding to me with the prohibition of eating chametz, which is a biblical prohibition. It's apples to oranges. In other words, I'm trying to bring a proof to you that I'm saying to you, the rabbis never made distinctions. Whenever they instituted anything, they don't make distinctions within the daytime itself. So where are you getting your idea to say that from sunrise and on, whenever the rabbis institute something, they either do full 24 hours or they do from dawn and on? Where do they ever distinguish within the day itself? And you are responding to me with the prohibition of eating chametz. That is a biblical thing, right? And when it comes to biblical distinctions, we can't really, God ultimately, we try to understand the prohibitions of the Torah, but do we really fully claim to fully understand them? We don't. And therefore, when the Torah itself makes a distinction within the day, we say, okay, that's what God said, no problem. We can't really fully rationalize it. But when the rabbis come along, they're going to do it in a rational, clean way, a way that they could justify. In other words, if the Torah says don't mix wool and linen, we say, okay, fine, whatever, that's what the Torah says. But when the rabbi is going to institute something, you would expect there to be a certain logic to it. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is pushing back against Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, you're trying to prove to me, oh no, days are broken up. Because you see with the prohibition of chametz, there is permitted in the beginning of the day and forbidden in the rest of the day. And therefore, that should be the same thing for the prohibition against work. He says, what are you talking about? With the fact that the Torah does it, that's God's domain. But we're talking about what the rabbis instituted, and there you'd expect it to be a clean break. And therefore, it should be dawn.
But the answer of Achilas Chametz on our Pesach is Deoraisa?
It is and it isn't. There's an isser of achilas chametz, as we'll see somewhere in the next bunch of daf. That is, there's a prohibition against eating chametz from midday and on. It is a full-fledged biblical prohibition. The prohibition that we have from whatever from 2 hours before that is rabbinic, and that's actually going to be his response. But it's worth noting that the prohibition against chametz on Erev Pesach is doraisa. It's just that Chazal or sages extended it to be safe. They added to it. And that's what his response is. V'idach sha'os d'Rabbanan. He says, yeah, I wasn't talking about the biblical hours of the day, which are prohibited. I was referring to the rabbinic ones. Okay, now, v'idach, and Rabbi Eliezer would respond to that. Harchakahu d'Rabbanan l'doraisa. He says, you can't bring me a proof from not eating chametz because, again, the Torah says from midday and on. The rabbis came along and just extended that, and therefore that's not really going to be and therefore this is not really relevant to our discussion.